Hello and welcome back to the Book Marketing Tips and Author Success Podcast. This is Penny Sansevieri.
And Amy Cornell.
And this is a companion episode to last week. So if you tuned in last week, if you didn't, no problem. These are also standalone shows. We're talking about podcasts in particular. And podcasts, so popular. We love doing our show. We are also avid podcast consumers. So we listen to a lot of podcasts. And we have a lot of authors that ask us to to pitch them to podcasts. So we thought this would be really helpful. I think this is very much on your mind. So I'm going to kick this off a little bit, but I want to turn the first segment over to Amy because she has very strong feelings about all the things. And I think that we talked about this in the last show, obviously, because it's worth repeating. Most authors treat, or a lot of authors treat, I'm going to say most, podcast as a promotional channel, and they are really a content channel, right?
Yes.
And I think if you start with that in mind, whether you're fiction or nonfiction, and again, regardless of your fiction, nonfiction, we're covering all of that in this companion episode. So Amy, why don't we start with the common pitching mistakes? Because that's where I think a lot of us get sort of like caught in our own bad advice.
Right, exactly. And again, it's one of those things too, we talk about all the time. First impressions matter, right?
Yes.
So you want to make a good impression because just because you're not a good fit for the show now and maybe what they have on their content calendar doesn't mean they won't contact you again in the future, right? So don't think of this as like your one shot at this show. If you handle yourself correctly, you can kind of keep that conversation going with them. So keep that in mind too when you do this. But the number one issue, the most common pitching mistake, like on a broader level, is that authors approach this, like Penny said, I'd love to come on your show and talk about my new book. Like, I wish we had that buzzer sound. I'm not going to do it, but you know what I mean? That is not at all what you want to do.
Sorry.
There you go. Thank you. But hosts, producers, they want to have interesting conversations. That's what they're there for. Anybody listening that listens to podcasts, you've probably turned something off before, or you've hit the skip button a billion times. And so you know that there are times where it's just not working and you don't want to be that person, or you don't want to give them the idea that like, oh, I'm not sure if this is quite the right fit for me. So pitching the book instead of the topic. Okay. Mistake number one. Podcast hosts, producers, they want ideas, they want expertise, they want interesting, fun, unique, clever conversation. They're not there to do a big ad for you, right? I think that is the number one thing you want to keep in mind. They are not there to give you free advertising. That's huge. So you don't pitch it. I wrote a book about resilience. You say why people misunderstand resilience and how to rebuild it. Like, look how much more engaging that is. That's a conversation in itself. Yes. So you have to think of pitching your book as starting the conversation, teasing the conversation, because the reaction you want is the host or producer to say, okay, yeah, I want to learn more. And that's when you've got them.
Right, exactly. And I think that, the majority, look, this is what I'm about to say. This is true for any publication, show, whatever, but podcasts depend on repeat listing behavior. Yes. Which is driven by content quality. And that's why a lot of times, these shows they have to be so picky. And in particular now the podcast world, because man, there is so much competition for these shows.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. I know. They definitely, shows look at other shows too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We look at other marketing shows. We look at other author-centric shows. So I promise you, shows are paying attention to other similar shows that are also catering to their audience. It is competitive. The content, is competitive. So that is also a very good point, Penny. That is something to keep in mind as well, is that, that's another reason you really want to be thoughtful about what you can offer and what you can bring to the table and what your audience is looking for. So kind of leave your book to the side with your, to be objective, leave your book to the side for the moment, because just by getting on the show, your book will get attention. Right. You will achieve that end. But if your focus is on the book, the message you send in the show is not going to come across that you were there for them.
Right. Well, the the other piece of it though, too, to keep in mind with podcasts that I particularly love is that when a host features somebody, the book is mentioned in the show notes, right? So there's always a link to the book in the show notes. That's great visibility for you. I check show notes on shows a lot, right? Links to your website, things like that. So it is definitely, it's such a great builder. It truly, truly is. And I think, we've sort of already touched on this, pitching the book instead of the topic. I mean, never pitch book forward when you're trying to go after some of these shows, right? These hosts, they want conversations. They don't want advertisements, right? And we talked about in the last episode, we also gave, some examples where as opposed to an author saying, I'd love to come on and talk about my book, or say something like, I wrote a book about resilience. There are better ways to frame that to get the host's attention, and you have to ask yourself, and sometimes I realize it's kind of hard because you're doing your own pitching maybe, and you're too close to it a lot of times. But you also, if you can get some distance and step back for a little bit and say, would this be something that I would actually want to listen to? Right. Would this be something that would make me click? And I'll tell you something, even though we don't have any guests on our show, we spend a lot of time when we're trying to figure out our show ideas. Obviously, we want to produce content, but we also want to produce content that people are going to listen to, because much as Amy and I love getting on, chats and blah, blah, and all the things, we're not just doing this to hear ourselves talk. You know what I mean?
That's my nightmare. So,
right. I know.
Thank you for listening.
Right. I know. I mean, we want to create content that is compelling, because that's where these podcasts are. They're very, very listener forward. Right.
Right.
Okay. So what's next on our lists?
These are very closely. Yeah. These are very closely linked, but pitching the wrong shows and not studying the podcast first. So, figuring out the right show. You should be looking for audience alignment, topic fit, engaged communities. You don't want to just pitch shows because they're big. That is definitely not necessarily a good use of your time, because bigger doesn't always mean the most appropriate for you. It doesn't mean you can't do that at some point. But anybody that's been listening for a while, we talk about you can't skip the line. Every win is a win. There's no such thing as too small of coverage or too little show or an influencer, you know what I mean, that's not worth your time. When you're just starting out, unless you've got a really impressive media background already, they're all worth your time, candidly,
Yeah.
So you really have to be open-minded about what makes sense for where you're at and what you can bring to the table and what your media background looks like, and go after shows that really make sense for that.
Yeah.
Smaller shows often produce better results because the audience is more focused. Those smaller shows are hungry to make names for themselves too. So they're looking for good content. They're hustling their butts on social media. They're doing all the things to get their show out there. So that is, it's a really great mutual benefit of you not necessarily going after these big shows that already have an established audience that don't necessarily need to do a lot to push their content. It can actually be a really strategic way to get more focused attention for your work and your perspective in your book by going after smaller shows that are just as hungry as you are.
Exactly. And the other thing though too is if you've been to any conferences and you've listened to like best-selling author panels and what makes your, how did you get to be so successful? The majority of them will tell you they never say no to an interview. Now, obviously you want to be on shows and in publications that are appropriate to your topic. I get it. Full stop. Hopefully you're not pitching, random weird stuff that has nothing to do with, like coast to coast, a UFO topic for a romance novel or something, unless the protagonist is an alien, in which case that's a different show altogether.
And probably exists.
I'm telling you, a shape-shifting alien. Of course, that probably exists. Never say no to an opportunity, right? And anybody, in fact, very well known, the Chicken Soup for the Soul authors. That's one of the things that they lead with in pretty much any talk that they do on book promotion. They did shows. They got up at 3:00 in the morning, obviously in the days before podcasts. They got up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do a tiny little radio interview in some small town they never said no because everything builds on everything else. And you're never too successful, frankly, to do all the things. Honestly, when you start saying no to opportunities, and this is, we tell our authors that work with us, like, we're not going to present you with an opportunity that we think is just some flim flam weird thing that you shouldn't even be doing, because that's a waste. That wastes everybody's time, right?
Exactly. Yep.
But that's also, look, that's how first off, you get more exposure, you get more links, more shareable content, and everything builds on everything else, right? So, I think, like, not studying the podcast first, and you're right. It is so aligned with pitching the wrong shows. It's a problem. And we talked about this in the last week. We get pitched for stuff all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
A, we don't have guests on, and B, a lot of the content that they're pitching is not something that we would ever, even if we had guests, that we would never feature on the show. So what that pitch ends up doing is, first off, it gets deleted, right? I don't respond to people, but it's a waste of everybody's time. And if you're hiring somebody to do this for you, be careful. You know what I mean? Because you're paying for that. You're paying for that time.
Right. And it's still your first impression. It may not be a good fit for us. And like Penny said, deleted. But I often scan just out of curiosity to see what they're, you know what I mean? Like, what are they offering? Because again, I'm nosy. I like to see what people pitch. It's what we do. So I kind of have this, like, all right, I want to see, how'd you do this? Let me see how you did. But so I do remember the author's name. I see the book cover, like all these things that are cemented in my memory. And that's the first impression I've had with that author and that book, which isn't great. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They had somebody doing the wrong kind of work for them. So again, not to make anybody super paranoid, but just it matters. It really matters. And, for what it's worth, we did a show on vetting marketing firms recently. Make sure that that's not how they roll.
Right.
I should have added that one in there. But it's true. You need to be familiar with the topics the show covers. What type of guests do they bring on? If they don't bring on guests, don't offer to be a guest, but figure out if there's another way that you can be helpful. You never know. Don't go way out of left field, but at the same time, you might be able to get creative and still offer to be a resource, still offer to send the host a book because, Penny, you mentioned this on the last show. They may end up sharing it on their social, just separate from the show, because it is a topic that they're interested in. It's just not a fit for their show content. So you never know what might happen with that. So if you know a show well enough and you actually pay attention to what the hosts are doing, how they handle their socials, things like that, you might realize that there are other opportunities there. And that actually shows that you get extra points for paying attention. Honestly, I think if somebody pitched a show, Penny, and it showed that they really understand that, no, I'm not trying to be on the show. I know that's not a good fit, but I do think this would be a benefit in X, Y, and Z ways. I mean, points to you,
Yeah, exactly. And, to your point, yeah. So I probably sounded a little caustic when I said, no, I just delete the message when they try to pitch us for shows. But honestly, there have been a number of really interesting books that were sent our way in these pitches. So an alternative would have been, and I'm not going to obviously offer this. I think that if you're especially if you're hiring somebody to do your pitching, they should have this knowledge. Offer to send a book to the show.
Right.
Like, it could have been an opportunity for us to say, look, as we're talking about, like, for example, doing a book cover show or something, and we got this book mailed to us and it was really great. And now watch, we're going to get like 50 books next week. But I'm just saying, I think that not studying the podcast first is a problem. And we actually tell our authors this when we book them on shows, like, you better be listening to that show. You need to be listening to that show so that you know how the host approaches the interviews, first off,
Yes.
Not the least of which is so you're not caught off guard.
100%.
Right.
Yes. Understanding the show, the host's mannerisms, what, how they tend to handle guests and things like that. Like, that's gold.
Yeah, absolutely. So strong podcast pitches. And I think this is really, any kind of strong pitch reduces decision friction for the host. right? So make it easy for them to say yes. Lead with the benefits of the book, and or if you've written fiction, we talked about this the last time. Talk about, you can talk about the process of writing. You can talk about the history behind historical fiction. The pop culture zeitgeist, all of the different things that you can speak to for, for those of you who have written fiction. I think that it has to matter to their listeners specifically, and you don't have to necessarily mention that in the pitch, but it should be very heavily mentioned. I mean, it should be, you know what I mean? There should be a very strong lean into how this is going to benefit their listeners, right? And if you have a really good pitch, it's obvious. You don't have to say, whoa, this is going to matter to your listeners because.
Right. And the thing, I think, we have this note on here, but I think it really kind of captures what the vibe is. Make it easy for the host to imagine the conversation they'd have with you.
Yes.
Right? Like if you and that's why, again, being concise and being very clear about what you're bringing to the table and why it's amazing, because you don't want to throw a lot at them and expect the host to do the work for you. Right?
Right.
They're not
Exactly.
Like if you throw a lot at them and you're like, I'm good at this, I'm good at that, or I did this and I did that, and my story covers this and this and this, and they're all relevant and it's all amazing, they're immediately going to be overwhelmed, and they're not going to put in the time and effort to try to sift through that and figure out how that would possibly work for them.
Right.
Exactly. You really have to show up with it on a silver platter and be like, look, I did all the hard work for you. All we have to do is schedule the time. Bam.
Yeah. I think the easier that you could make it to imagine the episode, the more likely that you will be to get booked. And this is something that I think authors need, listen to this. No matter where you are pitching yourself to, they're not doing the work because they're lazy at all. They're just busy, right? They're getting,
oh my God. Yes.
They're getting dozens of pitches a week potentially for some of these really, really, really big shows. They're probably getting more, right? And you have to really do the work, invest the time, invest the effort to do the work for them. That's another way to remove the decision friction, right? Keep in mind too, we talked a lot about, we mentioned a bunch of different podcast genres that both Amy and I listen to, but pretty much every media person now has a podcast. I mean, and I'm talking about like the Today Show is a podcast, and all these people have, and if that's something that you at some point aspire to, it's a great opportunity to start with, some of these smaller shows. And again, we don't say that in a bad way. Start with some of these smaller shows and build your expertise, because podcasts are a little bit like indoor plumbing. Like everybody seems to have one now. And there's a huge opportunity if you want. And I've talked to authors who do podcasts consistently and just absolutely love it. They absolutely love it. And they say, the more I do, the better I get. And that's another thing to consider too. Just in terms of, going at this being a good interview, the more you do, the better you'll get, for sure.
Oh yeah.
What did we not address in terms of the strong podcast, the pitching piece of this? What did I miss?
No, I mean, I don't think we missed anything. I mean, obviously, I think if you have something that, I think, again, being like Penny said, they're all very busy. They're getting tons of pitches. I think if you can be really concise and, again, make their verification, their vetting even simpler without going overboard and sending them an email that's super duper long, back up what you're bringing to the table with receipts. If you have a website and you kept it up and it's good, put that in there. If you've done media before, call that out. Do a link. Don't give, you know what I mean? A short bio, like a well-done bio that reinforces your area of expertise or your background as a fiction author and your, you know what I mean, what you specifically focus on. I think that's brilliant. Again, because they're not just going to, if they love your email, great. That's like, you're keeping the door open. They haven't slammed it shut. But they also will do their vetting. And if you can make it quick and easy for them to get you through that second checkpoint of okay, they've got some stuff going on, they've done this before, or their website looks solid. Clearly they're paying attention to their branding. Okay. Like you get through that second door, right? You get that second interview, so to speak. Right, Penny?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that, the goal isn't to get on more podcasts, but it is to become the kind of guest that podcasts really want. Right. And that's the thing, is that if you can put yourself in that kind of a mindset, is becoming the kind of guest, I mean, you will be amazed. And we've had authors who do a lot of shows and do really well, who end up getting shows that reach out to them directly, which is obviously a high quality problem to have.
100%.
All right. I think that we've covered it. I love talking about podcasts, just because I think it's, such a zeitgeist right now. Everybody's listening, and podcasts are actually, it's interesting too, just as a final note. If you don't think that your audience is listening to podcasts, think again, because 5 years ago, when we were first talking about podcasts, the listener demographic was much younger, but now podcasts have really, the listening demographic has aged quite a bit. So, and I don't have in front of me how many millions of people listen to podcasts, but it's become very universal in terms of, the listener demographic.
Yes, because a lot of us like to do, you can multitask while listening to a podcast.
Oh, I love, yes.
Yes.
Like I'm gardening or I'm doing whatever. Yeah.
Right. We're super busy, but we also don't want to give up on, these our areas of interest and things we love to learn about, or just pure entertainment while going about our daily lives. And podcasts are really a great answer to that. So to your point, Penny, I think that's 100% why they've gotten so popular.
Yeah.
Because they really just kind of fit in better to a lot of our busy lifestyles.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we hope that the show has been helpful. Wanted just to take one quick listener note. This isn't so much a question, but it was definitely worth mentioning. Just want to thank you for the tip on Amazon A+ content. My publisher got right on it after I requested it. See, sometimes you have to push your publisher because they're busy and they're like, oh yeah, we should do A+ content. I put my top 3 blurbs, as I have been frustrated with the editorial reviews tab is somewhat hidden on the book page. So thanks again. This really helped. So I am so pleased that you got your A+ content. We did a show on that. Actually, one of our recent very popular shows. If you haven't listened to that, I think we did it late last year. Was that when we did the A+ content?
I think so.
Yeah, it's hard to keep track. We keep
downloading. Feels like yesterday.
I know, it feels like yesterday. We keep downloading our podcast list from the feed service that we use because we do sometimes lose track. But thank you so much for listening. Listen, we love reviews wherever you listen to shows. So please leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. So text the word podcast to 888-402-8940. Send us your show ideas, your feedback, and your author questions, and we'll take them in the next show. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.